Welcome to Sapien Analysis. This video is brought to you by Allura Online. If you love our fantastic videos, guess what? Allura Online can create amazing content for you too. Want to elevate your brand with top-notch videos? Check out the Fiverr link in the description or send a private email for more details. Act now and snag some exclusive discounts. Don't miss out. Contact Allura Online today and take your content to the next level.
A lot of people out there, and to some extent, including me, that we don't really understand what ADHD is really. It's a behavioral manifestation of something that is going on inside the brain. However, we don't really understand that how it's happening, why it's happening, and what are the different ways that these behaviors can manifest itself. So if you could actually start with that, that would be very helpful.
Okay, I'd like to start with what you said.
Okay.
Because I think that there's an entire approach that is developing traction these days called the neurodiversity. And when you think about it, we expect all kinds of diversity among people. People have different color skin. We have different color hair. We have different talents. There's some people who are 7 feet tall and a gymnast who's 4'8". We have people who are, phenomenal music prodigies and people who can't carry a tune. And in the natural world, we have enormous diversity. We don't expect every tree to be a maple tree, and we don't call an oak tree a broken maple tree. So when we talk about and I'm going to call it neuropsychological differences, I don't think we have the science yet to say we can pinpoint exactly the neurology. There's a lot of studies and there's a lot that's been done, but it's not, I don't think, at the level of the average person, having access to this is what it is. But to think about the idea that the way we process the world is all of a sudden the one thing that has to be, there's only one way to do it or it's a disability. There's only one way to do it or it's pathological. And people who are ADHD, people who are on the autistic spectrum, people who have nonverbal learning disabilities like Tim Walsh's son, all have a different way of processing the world. They take in the world differently. They respond to the world differently. But to say that that's a pathology is to say that everybody has to do it the same way. So I think that when we think about ADHD, so many people with ADHD, I'll give it an example is John Irvine, who is a very, very famous writer. In school, he was told he was stupid and he would never amount to anything because, from what I gather, he was dyslexic. And from what I gather, he may or may not have had ADHD. But in any case, he was different. And if you're different, people think that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, when in fact, you may be very bright, very creative, and have all kinds of things to contribute that people who are processing differently don't contribute. So I want to sort of shift and talk about ADHD and whatever else we might talk about, not from the perspective that we are talking about pathology alone, that we are talking about people who are broken versions of normal, but rather people who sort of are wired to process in a different way. So all of that said, which is a lot, there are basically 2 kinds or 3 kinds of ADHD that people talk about. One is inattentive, where the ability to sustain attention is challenged, and people who are inattentive can seem to be in their own world or daydreaming sometimes. They have difficulty with executive functions like keeping things organized and kind of being able to inhibit being distracted. But it's primarily around attention. The other kind is hyperactivity, So when you have attention deficit hyperactivity, those are the kids who are, bouncing off of everything and need constant sort of stimulation and are hyperactive compared to the activity level we expect. Although I think that sometimes these days what we expect is pretty strange in and of itself. I had someone who came to me saying that there's a 5-year-old was, probably had ADHD because he wasn't sitting quietly in circle time in school. And I said, he's not sitting quietly in circle time because he's 5 years old. Being 5 isn't a disability.
Right.
But and then there's another kind of ADHD called combined, where you both have issues with attention and hyperactivity. An interesting thing about ADHD is that much of what we know about it in terms of the kind of issues of distractibility, of how people have emotional regulation, the fact that sometimes people are quick to react or, impulsive to react, the kind of things that we look for are all based on studies of males. In ADHD, like so much else in medicine and in other fields, they only studied boys, and they studied prepubescent boys. So there's very little known, or it's just starting to be talked about ADHD in girls. And specifically also what impact hormones have on how ADHD presents in girls. So you've opened up a whole can of worms here, because we're not only talking about kids who are, when most people are focusing and they're like, they have blinders on, they're just focusing straight on what they're being told to focus on. The person who has ADHD's focus is much wider. They're taking a lot more in, and that means they may not be focusing exactly where you want them to focus. But on the other hand, they're kind of out of the box because they've got so much more that's coming in. They may be having ideas that other people aren't having because their focus is so narrow. So while if what you want is for a child to hold still and read, and you have a child with ADHD where sustaining attention is a problem or hyperactivity is a problem, he may have trouble holding still. He may have trouble remembering what he read. He may have to read it and then reread it and then reread it before the information really sticks, because it's hard to sustain attention. Or he may be sort of wiggly squiggly and can only hold still long enough to say read part of it. So that's kind of what we think of when we think of ADHD. We also think of kids who are maybe impulsive. They talk out in class, they blurt out, they're raising their hands. And girls aren't picked up as early because there's more attention inattention in girls. And so girls who seem to be inattentive are also often that said, well, they're just, their minds are on other things. They're too social. They're thinking about boys, or they're thinking about whatever gender they're thinking about. And it's kind of more blamed on them that they're not motivated, rather than that they have ADHD, unless somebody actually explores ADHD as a possibility they have checklists that parents and teachers and kids fill out about, paying attention and being distracted and being able to have working memory, being able to sort of inhibit behavior, all these kinds of things, to say, does somebody have enough criteria of ADHD to meet ADHD, the diagnosis. Another thing that's interesting is that I say kids because we're often talking about starting it. We see it as kids. They also, what we call comorbid. It coexists with all kinds of other things. We tend to think of diagnoses and that's who you are. And really, a diagnosis just describes a part of who you are. It describes something that may be a very important part of you are that has to be that gives us a way to be helpful. But many kids who have ADHD are also on the spectrum, or they also may have sensory issues, or they may also have learning issues. They may be very talented in some field. There are kids who are called twice exceptional, meaning that they have some issue like ADHD or being on the spectrum or learning issue, and they're extremely smart. They're gifted. So when you do research and you throw out everybody who has ADHD and something, and you only look at the kids who only have ADHD, you're really throwing out most people, because people who come into my office tend to be pretty complicated, and you've got more than one thing going on. So but one of the issues for kids with ADHD is that they are often blamed for their behavior. In other words, you should sit still. If you look at the sign they have on walls in kindergartens, it says quiet, eyes, ears, quiet hands, quiet body. And if you're wired to have a wiggly body and to have trouble, holding still and having your hands be quiet and sustaining your attention is difficult unless it's really interesting, the kid's going to fail the poster. And we tend to blame the kid for it, and then say to the parent, Johnny isn't doing what we want him to do, instead of understanding that maybe Johnny has to move around in order to listen, or maybe Johnny has to, have a quiet background in order to listen because he's distracted by sounds. So I think that understanding not only the issues of ADHD, that the person has executive functions, as I talked about, like beginning to start something, being able to sustain your effort, being able to inhibit distractibility, being able to prioritize and organize, being able to organize materials. All these things are executive functions. And if you think about executive functions, including being able to transition from one thing to another, or multitask, so to speak, if you're, it's very difficult if you have ADHD to do that and sustain your working memory. Your working memory is having things stay in your mind as you're doing something. So if you have trouble working memory and you're writing, it's a perfect storm, because you have to think about what you asked me. I have to think about what I want to say. I have to think about how to put it into a grammatical sentence. I have to remember how to spell the sentence. I have to be able to write it down. I need to be able to check back to make sure the sentence said what I wanted it to say. I have to think about the next sentence. And that's a lot of transitions. That's a lot of organization. That's a lot of working memory. And so when you think about one of the challenges, you don't think about writing. But in fact, writing can be a challenge because there's so much working memory and so much transition involved. So there are issues with ADHD that are challenges that people don't think about. But also, people with ADHD are out of the box creative. And that, if you go to something like Saturday Night Live, probably a lot of the writers have ADHD, because these are people who are thinking of things who other people aren't thinking of. So when we talk about a neurological pathology, I'm going to say, hey, let's broaden our vision here to look at the challenges, but also to look at the strengths.
Okay. So, instead of pathology, you actually wanted to use the neurodiversity in that sense, so that it can encompass and include all these different types of diversity, neurological diversity that otherwise we'll call pathology, with the lack of better understanding. So that could be included. So that makes sense. I was actually thinking about, when you said Saturday Night Live, I actually watch a lot of them, and it makes sense that they are so creative for sure. Does it actually, a certain level of attention is always needed for any type of creative work? If somebody has ADHD, which is basically a part of it is attention deficit, so how they can actually do those creativity, or is it like for that particular creative work they are more focused?
Well, one thing that you'll find in any description of ADHD is that ADHD children and adults, because ADHD children grow up, many of them still have signs of ADHD when they grow up. And certainly some inattentive kids aren't caught when they're very young because their inattention is attributed to other things. But ADHD kids, even who are identified as ADHD, can hyperfocus. So they will stay focused for hours on something that really interests them. They'll say, how can he have ADHD? He can work on Legos for 2 hours, or he can, do this other thing for hours. And so if it's interesting and engaging and what you're doing, you can stay focused on it. So that, and if you think about it, if we just imagine as flies on the wall, which neither of us are, in a writing session for something like Saturday Night Live, people are probably bouncing ideas off each other,
Right.
And I say something and you say something, and then you think of something, and then I think of something with you think of something, and we're both really engaged in it, right?
Right.
And so that would sustain both of our focus because
Right.
we'd be really interested in it. It would be creative, and it would, one of the things I remember hearing about ADHD when I was in training is that the teacher would be talking about, well, we're going to give a star if you get the answer right, and the kid thinks stars. Well, stars are kind of cool. I mean, I heard that there's all these stars and they're way out there, and stars have planets, and wouldn't it be cool to be an astronaut and go visit planets? And what do you have to do to be an astronaut? Well, do I have to join the Air Force? And the kid is off.
Right.
He's in the Air Force.
Right.
And, so there's all kinds of ways that, you can go if you're following, your pathway. And so, as I said, it's ideal for something where you're creative and you're taking things on and on. I wouldn't want an ADHD air traffic controller.
Right. Okay, so that
and one more thing I want to throw in, and I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
But school is, when I've seen in America anyway, when there's a survey of high school kids and they ask kids to describe school, many of them will say tiring and boring, because school is the only time when you have to study everything and be good at everything, and probably some significant part of it is boring and not that engaging for you.
Right.
And so we're expecting every kid to sustain attention to everything. And you went into cancer research and I went into psychology because that interested us. And maybe you don't want to have to sit down and write essays on Victorian literature. That might not be your strength, but when you were in school, somebody wanted you to do that.
Right.